Isn't here yet. Hey!
Hey! Calling Chris Anderson in London.
This is Chris Anderson in London, calling Rick Beyer in Chicago.
Well, Rick Beyer in Chicago is present and in the house.
You're all with us now.
I'm reading you 5x5 over this giant, Ethernet shortwave system we're on.
Wow. Okay.
It's pretty crazy.
It is.
So we'll just wait a moment for people to get started, for people to join us. Please post something and let us know that you're here. And I see people are already starting to do that, Chris.
That is good. Yeah.
Who's there?
Oh, Xavier is joining us from Spain.
Yes, excellent, Xavier.
Pat, Ken, John from Toronto.
We have the New York Jets joining us from East London.
There we go.
At the suggestion of a super fan. We have Jack and John.
Is that your? But somebody must be your sister then.
I don't know, but I do want to remind everybody that we are here talking about history every Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern on the Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours Facebook and YouTube pages. Congratulations, you found us, and all of our broadcasts are also archived on the History Happy Hour webpage, which is on Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours website. And then we also have our list of our future guests and our reading list and other wonderful sleep-inducing material there if it's late at night and you need something to kind of ease you off into that gentle land of Nod.
Yes.
Am I overselling?
I think you have, yeah.
Sorry about that.
Maybe you were waxing poetic there a bit.
I don't know. Sometimes I'm inspired. That topic or the guest or the show inspires me to that poetic moment. But do you think we're ready, Chris, to get underway? Want to give us the tradition?
The bar is open.
The bar is open, and Chris, what are we serving today?
Well, I'm I'm very excited about today. A little bit of backstory. To my father's infinite regret, I've never really gotten naval warfare. My dad's a Navy man, and he would always impress upon me Samuel Eliot Morison and tales of battles in the Pacific, and I have a really hard time understanding ships and boats and all of that sort of thing. But then I discovered Craig Symonds, and he has written a number of books. Professor Symonds is a professor of emeritus at the U.S. Naval Academy. He's written extensively about the Civil War. He wrote a wonderful book about the Battle of Midway. And our subject for tonight, Operation Neptune, which is a fantastic book about the D-Day landings, but it has a heavy emphasis on the naval component of it. And the thing I love so much about his books is he makes a topic which confuses me greatly, very accessible, and very entertaining. So, Professor Symonds, thank you for helping me understand this stuff.
Oh, you're welcome, Chris. Thank you for having me on the show. Happy to be here.
We're delighted to have you here. Chris, my father's infinite regret, I never became a New York Yankees fan. So we all have issues.
Dodge that bullet.
Yeah, exactly. But Craig, welcome to History Happy Hour. I hope you have your cocktail with us and that you're ready to roll here. And Chris, I hope you're fortified with the usual and that everybody else, that you've got yours. And Mr. Anderson, take us away.
All right. Professor Symonds, one question we want to get to Exercise Tiger, but before we do, I want to talk a little bit about your book, Operation Neptune. It's a really important book. It's a book I use all the time when I'm getting ready for my tours. But in the whole long list of books about D-Day, yours is kind of new to the pile. What made you all of a sudden say, I want to look at D-Day, and what did you think was missing at the story that you wanted to tell, and what did you want to find out about it?
Well, I think what motivated me, for the most part, is that when you read about D-Day, when you see films about D-Day, of which there are a number of very excellent films, often the story begins with the landing on the beach. You see the troops coming ashore, that drop front bow falls into the sand, the troops run out, they're slaughtered by the machine guns and taking on the German defenses. And that's where the story begins. But of course, getting to that point is really the most important part of the story. It's not quite as sexy, maybe, as the actual fighting on Omaha and Utah and Gold, Juno and Sword. But without all of that precursor. Without that run-up, it never would have happened at all. And the other thing that I think gets forgotten in this discussion is that once the men get to the beach, they have to be sustained there. They need food, they need ammunition, they need gasoline, they need backup, they need replacement vehicles. All of these things are essential, and they all have to come by sea. Virtually all have to come by sea. So the Army kind of had this view that, well, the Navy role, they're the bus drivers. They get us there, but then we're the ones who actually do the fighting. And that's to a certain extent true. But my father, who was a realtor, used to say there were 3 rules about determining the value of property, and that was location, location, location. And in the same way, when you're talking about amphibious warfare in particular, it's logistics, logistics, logistics. And logistics aren't as sexy as combat, but it's the central element of the story, and I wanted to tell that story.
Now, what's that? You mentioned that aphorism. Was it amateur study strategy and professional study
Right.
logistics? Yeah.
Right.
So we want to. The reason we invited you on is because we had one of our audience members wanted us to do a show about Exercise Tiger, and you have a chapter about that in your book, and that is a part of the run up to D-Day. It's a big part of the Neptune story, and it's a large scale rehearsal that in, I guess, March of 1944 that goes wrong. It is visited by tragedy. So kind of give us a little overview of what's going on there, and then we can dive into some of the specifics.
Well, there is, as I suggested earlier, a long run-up to what happens on D-Day itself. And it began really as early as January. Here's a million or so American soldiers, 500,000 Brits, all established in these camps all across not only the southern coast of Britain, but really up both coasts as well, in the Bristol Channel and the Thames Estuary. They're just all over the place. Many of them have not participated in an amphibious operation before. And even the Americans coming over, many of those, as one young soldier said, I went straight from boot camp to combat. So they had to figure out what they were supposed to be doing. And to do that, of course, you have to have rehearsals. And amphibious operations are sufficiently complex that if you have not been through it a couple of times, it can really go completely wacky. So beginning in January and then increasingly through February, as the air warmed, the water still stayed pretty cold, but at least it got to be tolerable. And then into March and especially April, there are a series of these rehearsals, full-scale rehearsals, where a division-sized unit would embark with all their equipment and their arms and their live ammunition, and they'd get on these ships and they'd head out into the channel and then come back ashore onto a practice beach. Live fire screaming over their head, mines going off in the water, and they'd climb down into the landing craft, they'd go ashore and they'd run inland, and they'd capture some little abandoned town somewhere inland. And all of these rehearsals were named for creatures that were presumed to be amphibious. I got a list of them here because I knew I wouldn't be able to remember them all. And now I can find my list.
We can play some waiting room music.
Don't give me a hard time now.
Elevator music, the Jeopardy theme. It's all good.
I've got it. You can stop making fun of me now. Duck.
Never.
Duck, of course, is amphibious. Beaver, that makes sense. Fox, muskrat, otter, mink. But by April, they're kind of running out of animals that are genuinely amphibious, which is how we end up with Exercise Tiger. I don't know. I guess tigers can swim.
Right.
But I've never seen one, so I can't testify it to person. But anyway, this is one of a series. It's not the only one, but it is a large-scale landing. It happens to involve Force U. That is the force that's intended to land on Utah Beach. And that's under a guy named Don Moon, Rear Admiral Don Moon. And he's going to load up Lightning Joe Collins, 7th Division, on his ships. There's Moon on the screen, pretty handsome looking guy. And take them out into the middle of the channel at night, of course. And then with dawn, they're all going to land on this little strip of beach called Slapton Sands, which is just a mile or so to the west of the Dart River, to the east of Plymouth and to the west of the Dart, which is where the Britannia Royal Naval College is located. And Slapton Sands is chosen because it has some of the geographical characteristics of Utah Beach. It's, first of all, it's misnamed. That looks like sand, I know, but it's not. It's what's called shingle. These are pebbles, about, I don't know, if you remember silver dollars from long ago, they're about the size of a silver dollar. Billions of pebbles all over this beach. Those hotels and let cottages were not there at the time, of course. But behind it, you see Slapton Lay, which is a brackish water supply, just as Utah Beach had behind it a marshy swamp that had to be circumnavigated or bridged. And then beyond that, you see the hillside with the hedgerows cutting it up into pieces, just as the bocage did in the land behind Utah Beach. So the physical similarities between the landing beach here at Slapton Sands and the one across the channel at Utah Beach were similar enough that it was just almost an ideal practice landing beach. And they conducted several there, but this is also where Exercise Tiger took place in April. I think it's April, I want to say 28th.
Yeah.
I think that's right.
27th,
28th of 1944. So a month, 5 weeks before the planned invasion, which was originally scheduled for May 1st, and then, of course, postponed till June. So that's the setup for this. Now, what goes wrong? Well, almost everything. One of the difficulties, not only with amphibious operations, where you have the Army and the Navy that have to cooperate, this is a joint amphibious operation where you have the British Army and the Royal Navy, the American Army, and the United States Navy. So essentially 4 command elements, all of which have to cooperate. And they all have to go to sea at the same time and work together to get to the same place at the same hour. And even a rehearsal is sufficiently complex that things can go wrong, and they did. And probably one of the most important things that went wrong was that the second wave of this exercise is done in 2 waves. And the second wave consists of 8 LSTs, fully packed, 350 men, 20 tanks, 20 trucks on each one, jam-packed with equipment, material, and manpower. 8 of these, plus a number of smaller LCTs, all go out to sea, heading for the center of the channel so they can turn around and come back ashore again. And they're supposed to be escorted by 2 Royal Navy ships. They're U.S. Navy LSTs, but the escorts are both Royal Navy ships. So they head out of Plymouth, but on the way out, Plymouth Harbor is so crowded, it's just ships everywhere as far as the eye can see, and in jostling about to make the exit, 2 of them collide. And one of them is the British destroyer Scimitar. And it has a big gouge, hit by an American landing craft, wouldn't you know, we did it. But it's sufficiently damaged that the commander of the port orders it to go back into the yards for repair, not appreciating he's just removed 50% of the escort capacity for this exercise. So this group goes to sea on the night of the 27th with 8 LSTs, fully packed, extraordinarily valuable, and we can talk about the importance of the LSTs in a few minutes. But there they go out to sea with only 1 ship to escort it, and it's the smallest ship in the Royal Navy, virtually. It's a Flower-class corvette. I don't know how many in your audience know what a Flower-class corvette is. I love the Brits. I love the Brits because they decide that they will name all the warships of this class after a flower, which is how you get HMS Bluebell and Buttercup and Daffodil and so on. Well, this is the HMS Azalea.
Everybody wants to serve on those ships.
Everybody wants to be on one of those ships. So the Azalea is out in front about a mile ahead, and all hell breaks loose behind them at about 1 o'clock in the morning. Now it's April 28th in mid-English Channel. Now I'm going to stop there so that Chris can ask me what happened.
Well,
I think we now see who's in charge of this show, Chris.
well, no, but before we get to that, one of the things that kind of strikes me in reading the book, and that I'm curious to know more about, is this command relationship between the British and the American. Because one of the things that you read in a lot of books are just how well we work together. But most of the books talk about the land component, right? Everybody knew Montgomery was in charge, and then Bradley was going to take over, and it all seems to run very. But then when you read your book, that doesn't seem to be as smooth. And I was wondering if you could explain it and maybe why it's different with the name.
Yeah, actually, that's a great question, because first of all, I'm going to take issue with the land operations were all brotherhood and apple pie, and we're all happy and crumpets, or whatever the apple pie equivalent is for the Brits.
Apple pie and crumpets.
That worked largely because Eisenhower was determined to make it work.
Right.
I mean, he laid down the law. We're all on the same side. The great line from Eisenhower, he says, "I don't mind if you call another officer a son of a bitch. People will do that. Maybe they really are sons of bitches. But anybody who refers to a British son of a bitch will be packed and sent back to the States the next day." So he laid down the law. He was going to make this work. Well, his maritime counterpart is a guy named Bertram Ramsey. Now, Bert Ramsey it's not that he's a flamer. Here, this is a great photo, by the way. There in the center, we see Eisenhower, and the expression on his face tells you all you need to know. A benign, pleasant, easygoing chap who can get along with anybody. To his right, that is to the left of the photo, is Bertram Ramsey. Bertram Ramsey was a career officer. He had actually retired in 1938, called back into active service in 1939, and then was in charge of the evacuation from Dunkirk in 1940. So he was in charge of leaving Europe, and now he's going to be in charge of getting back into Europe. But he's not quite the benign politician that Eisenhower is. And of course, the guy on the right of the photograph to Eisenhower's left, he is no kind of politician. That's Bernard Montgomery, who you either loved him if you didn't know much about him, or you hated him. But Ramsey, of course, has 5 subordinates, one for each landing beach. So he's got 3 Brits working for him and 2 Americans. Don Moon is one of the 2 Americans. And in charge of both the American groups is a guy named Kirk, Alan Goodrich Kirk. And Kirk is a bit of a troublemaker. I mean, he looks for trouble, I think. He didn't even get along with Chester Nimitz, and that's hard to do. So Kirk is a bit of a troublemaker, and Ramsey's not going to put up with any stuff. Kirk actually went to Ramsey and said, "Look, this whole setup of shared command is no good. I need a bigger command area because I need to be in charge of this, that, and the other thing." And Ramsey looked back at him and said, "You Yanks, you always want to be in charge of stuff. I won't do it. Go back to your command and do what I tell you." Words to that effect. I'm ad-libbing a bit. But so there was a frisson of rivalry between the British and the Americans on this. But I don't think that's the centerpiece behind what happens at Exercise Tiger. I think the loss of one of the 2 escorts, which was inadvertent, is part of it. But part of it, too, is that there had been so many rehearsals, so many practice landings, and here we are on another practice landing. Okay, let's get this over with so we can go to the pub tomorrow. And so when tracer bullets start flying by and torpedoes are furrowing the water, they think, boy, this is a really realistic exercise. How about this, huh? And not really until it was literally too late did I think the Americans, and the British for that matter, appreciate what was happening to them in the middle of the English Channel.
Mm-hmm. So what a perfect like segue. So what happened to them, Craig?
Do we even need to be here, Chris? Can we go off to the top and let Craig finish this?
All right, I know you've got a picture of an E-boat, an S-boat, Schnellbooten. Yeah, here's one right here.
Just why is it an E-boat and an S-boat?
The Germans called it a Schnellbooten, fast boat. So to them it was an S-boat. but the British tended to call it an E-boat, and I'm not really sure what the origin of that is. But if you read in the British archives and the American archives, it's always referred to as an E-boat, and in the German archives, it's an S-boat. So, whatever.
Go figure.
But you could think of it as kind of a PT boat on steroids. It's a little bit bigger, a little bit tougher, a little bit faster than an American PT boat, but it has the same tactical function. It carries you can see some of the well, you can't really see the torpedoes here, but you can see the torpedo tube exit toward the bow there, that little flap. So it carries 4 torpedoes that can go 5 to 6 miles. They're pretty substantial with a big impact. And so there are 9 of these that put out from Cherbourg in occupied France on the night of the 27th. And it's not because they know this exercise is happening. They don't. This is just a routine patrol, so that's bad luck for somebody. But they get out there in the middle of the night, and there, by golly, in front of them are these large, dark, they're steaming blacked out, of course, these large, dark silhouettes of LSTs. Now, LST is a big ship, 310 feet long. It's good size. They're as big as a cruiser. So here they are. Here's one of them. And they just start launching torpedoes. And the Americans don't even know what's happening until one of them blows up. One of the LST skippers hears at about 1 o'clock in the morning what he described later as a scraping sound underneath the hull. That's not a good thing to hear, by the way. Probably a torpedo going by, just missing. The LSTs are flat bottomed in order to beach themselves, as we saw in that image. So they're not very deep draft. So this one scrapes by just underneath. And he sends the crew to general quarters, but of course they think, oh, well, it's another exercise, and they go to general quarters. Then pretty soon there's tracer rounds going back and forth. It's pretty colorful stuff. Tracer round, or every 5th or 6th bullet has a illuminating device in it, so you can actually follow your shots as you're firing. And the Germans used green and the Americans used red. So it looks like Christmas in Times Square, red and green tracer shots going around, torpedoes in the water. About 2 o'clock in the morning, one of the LSTs is struck and it blows up. And then another one is struck and it blows up. And then another one is struck. So it's kind of a massacre. They never do identify these fast boats, whatever you want to call them, E-boats, in the water. The Azalea hears this, the one escort vessel, and turns around and comes back, but he doesn't know whether it's submarines or E-boats or what's going on. And by the time he gets there, the damage is done and the Germans have departed. So the Allies have lost 3 LSTs, most of its equipment, and about 650 men. So it's a pretty serious disaster. And if you really want a supreme irony here, the 650 killed in Exercise Tiger in April is more than the number of Allied military personnel who will be killed on Utah Beach on D-Day. So there's actually more death lost in the rehearsal than was lost in the actual execution of the invasion.
Rick?
Well, I guess one of the questions that you have to ask here. Well, first of all, I had a question. You said the E-boats all came from Cherbourg, and somebody had mentioned to me before that some E-boats were stationed on Guernsey at one point, and they were just trying to make sure, did they actually all come from Cherbourg, or did some come from Guernsey, some come from Cherbourg?
These 9, as far as I know, I'm pretty sure about this, these 9 all came from Cherbourg. Now, they did have E-boat outlets at Le Havre and on the Channel Islands and elsewhere. I mean, they're a coastal defensive weapon. And so they're all along the occupied coast there. But these 9 were a single squadron that came out of Cherbourg. And that, by the way, was one of the arguments between Kirk and Ramsey. Kirk wanted to send American battleships over to Cherbourg and blast the harbor to sort of preempt the Germans from doing that. And Ramsey wouldn't let him do it because Ramsey said, that's going to let them know what we're up to. So no. So Kirk blamed Ramsey for not letting him do it. And Ramsey blamed Kirk for being insubordinate. And there we go.
And I'm going to add to that a question from Doug McCord. And I will say that Doug is the person who encouraged us to do an Exercise Tiger program. So Doug is the reason you're here. You may want
Thank
to
you,
blame,
Doug.
You may want to thank him. You may
Or
want to
curse him.
blame him. We don't know. But he said, were they all from one flotilla? So, or are they from multiple flotillas?
I believe that's true, and if I'd known you were going to ask this question, I would have looked it up for you.
Yeah,
beforehand,
Doug,
but
if
I'm
you'd
pretty
known.
sure that's true.
So we'll try to get Doug to warn about the questions next
Yeah.
time.
Okay. Yeah.
And I'll just go with one more here. On the E-boats, I understood, and I think you mentioned in this book that these boats are picked up on radar, but somehow, and maybe this is part of the intra-service, inter-country issues. Somehow, the warning never gets to the people on the water.
Yeah, the boats were picked up on radar as they exited Cherbourg Harbor, but the problem is that's a British command. So that goes to the commander-in-chief of Plymouth, and he notifies his folks there. And in fact, that's one of the things that encouraged him to send out a second escort, which arrives just in time to pick up one or two survivors, and that's about all.
Yeah.
But it doesn't make it through. Not only does it not make it from the British to the American command, it then doesn't get from the American command out to the American flotilla commander, a guy named Commander Scahill, who's in charge of the 8 LST. He never gets that information. So yes, it's a breakdown, partly inter-service, partly international, partly just land to sea. There are so many connective elements here that those things do happen.
So, Craig, one of the questions that I've gotten before too, and maybe you can, I don't know, you might know something about this, is so the Germans launch these torpedoes, they see some big explosions, they sail back to Cherbourg, and they all have schnapps and pat each other on the back. But do they do anything with this information? Do they have any idea of what they've just done? Or, what's going on?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, because you have to assume they figure, boy, I saw things blow up, I saw ships sink, and it's in the instinct of every unit commander, for the flotilla commander to go back and say, wow, I sank, let's see, probably 3, let me double it, 6 ships.
Yeah.
Well, if you're sinking a number of ships out in mid-channel in the middle of the night, something's going on. So clearly the Germans are aware of this. And yet, the Americans in particular, Eisenhower personally, went out of his way to make sure that the extent of the damage, the extent of the sinkings, and particularly the loss of life, is kept on the QT. All the survivors were sent to hospitals in order to keep them incommunicado from the press, because he didn't want anybody to know this had happened. In fact, it remains a secret until after the war is over. The extent of the losses at Slapton Sands, and it's often referred to as Slapton Sands, although it actually takes place in Lyme Bay as they were going to Slapton Sands. All of that remains absolutely secret because Eisenhower didn't want the Germans to know just how effective this stealth attack had been. And he was, and remember, 5 days from now, there's going to be another rehearsal. He doesn't want the people who are going to engage in that rehearsal to know this has happened. I'm not going out there on that. So all of that sort of feeds into his decision to keep this secret, and it stays secret for a good year.
Yeah, I will say that one of the things that has really surprised me, I've talked to some guys, veterans that had been part of the training exercise on shore. They were going to be there on shore. Just how quickly word came down to just, you didn't see anything, shut up, nothing happened.
Right.
But just how quickly they reacted to the disaster.
Yeah, one of the great fears is that Eisenhower knew that one of the officers who was on one of the LSTs had been in the planning group for Overlord. So he had the plans in his mind. I mean, not on paper, obviously, but they didn't know how many Americans had been plucked out of the water by the E-boats. None is the answer to the question. But as far as Eisenhower or anybody else on the Allied side knew, perhaps they'd pulled some of these guys out of the water, subjected them to fierce interrogation. Maybe they would find out where the landing beaches were, when it was going to happen, and all of that was. But Eisenhower exhaled when he found out that one of the bodies recovered from the water was the body of this individual who had been in the planning group for Overlord. So at least that didn't happen, but it was a possibility.
We have a bunch of questions from folks, so I want to try
Okay.
to bring in a few of those, and I'm going to start here with one from Cotton Smith, which is long, but the question that he gets to in here is two questions. One, did Exercise Tiger contribute anything to the ultimate success of Overlord, even though it itself was a catastrophe? And the question two, sort of the flip side of that question, had it not happened and there had been no problem, would anything have been different in the Normandy invasion?
Well, frankly, I suspect not in both cases. It's impossible to say, remove this thing that happened, how would subsequent events have played out? But to my knowledge, none of the plans that the Allies had in place for what would happen 5 weeks hence were changed. There were no reallocation of resources. The only real problem was the loss of 3 LSTs was potentially disastrous because, quite frankly, the LST was the single greatest bottleneck in World War II for the Allied ability to take on any operation, certainly any amphibious operation. LSTs were so useful. They were a big barn with doors that opened, and you could store anything in there. Officers wanted to use them for afloat stowage, for the transportation of troops, of equipment, of trucks and tanks, and everything else, and there just weren't enough of them. LSTs, as I mentioned, were a big ship. It took a while to build them, and we didn't get started until late 42. So by mid-1944, we were just on the edge of having not quite enough. Eisenhower told Admiral King that with the loss of those 3 ships, I need 3 more now, at least 3 more. King said, I haven't got 3 more. Can you get them for the Mediterranean? Well, the British commander in the Mediterranean says, I have not got 3 to spare. And King says to the British, if you send 3 from the Med, I'll send you 3 from here. So the British say, well, why don't you just send him the 3 that you've got? And because they wouldn't get there in time. Well, they wouldn't get there in time for me either. So this kind of conversation goes back and forth and really just illuminates how critical the LSTs were. So we think of the 630, 40, 50 men who were killed in the Lime Bay disaster in Exercise Tiger. But for Eisenhower, as a cold-blooded planner, the loss of those 3 LSTs is almost as bad because he's got to find a way to replace them, and that's going to be hard.
You know, something that I have enjoyed discovering as a recently transplanted New Englander coming to the Midwest once again is that many of the LSTs were made not in shipyards on the ocean, but in places like Ohio and Indiana and Illinois, and then sailed down like the Illinois River and through locks and down to the Mississippi and down to New Orleans and then get to Europe. And it's been referred to as the Cornfield Navy.
Exactly.
An expression that I love.
Yeah.
And it's also, somebody points out, Matt mentions that one of the E-boats, number 130, that was part of exercise that devastated Exercise Tiger, has been restored, is in the process of being restored in the UK.
Oh.
And there's an LST now that's been restored that's in Evansville, Indiana.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
it's all of this stuff stays with us. Can I bring in one more question from
absolutely.
of your, Chris? So we had a question about Wally wanted to know if the E-boats played a role on D-Day, and I had that was my related question, which was if they were so successful at devastating this exercise, which is, let's face it, if we look at the map, it's not that far from where the D-Day landings take place. Why didn't we hear more from them on the night of June 4th and June 5th?
Oh, we did. The Germans launched a flotilla. I think it's 14. I'm going to guess. Don't take that number to the bank. But a number of E-boats out of Le Havre, which is on the other side of the Bay of the Seine, the D-Day landing area. On the night of the first full night of the invasion, on D-Day, on the 6th of June. And they went out as far as they dared, launched all their torpedoes in the general direction of this 6,000 ship fleet. Seems like you could hardly miss. Talk about a target-rich environment. So they launched all their torpedoes and then turned around and sped back into Le Havre. And they did, I think they got one destroyer. I think it was actually a Norwegian destroyer.
Yeah,
right. And one was headed right toward Ramsey's command ship, the Largs, and the Largs, hard right rudder and just went zipping past. So the potential was there for another disaster, but being aware of it and sensitive to it and looking out for it, and good luck, prevented the E-boats from having even a greater impact during the D-Day operation itself than they did in the Lime Bay.
So, Craig, one of the other things I think maybe I'd like you to talk about is the impact of this disaster on Admiral Moon. Right?
Yeah,
because he's got, that guy's got a cloud over him.
Yeah, I actually interviewed both of his children to find out as much as I possibly could about him. For those who don't know the story, he of course had this difficulty in Lime Bay. Difficulty is an understatement, and supervised the landings at Utah Beach, which didn't go exactly according to Hoyle. They landed in the wrong position, although that turned out to be not a bad thing. But then he was immediately pulled out of the channel and sent down to supervise the landings in Operation Anvil, or Dragoon, as Winston Churchill liked to call it, on the south coast of France. And that, too, was another operation where you had to bring in new ships, and the British and the Americans, and landing and rehearsals and all of this business. And he just got so wrapped up in it, apparently, that one night in his cabin, sitting in his underwear, he took out his service pistol and blew his brains out.
Well, because he'd also had the PQ-17 disaster, too.
He had been, yes, that's true. He'd been involved in the convoy around the North Cape heading toward Murmansk and Archangel that had been ordered to scatter. Foolish decision, in the belief that the German heavy ships were coming out, which they didn't do. But having scattered, they were easy pickings then for the German submarines and airplanes, and PQ-17 turned out to be another disastrous experience. So Don Moon had some hard service, without any doubt. So that could in fact be the full explanation. But of course, Americans that we are, we love conspiracy theories. So of course somebody comes up, oh no, this was a sinister German execution, or did some and so I tried to look into that as carefully as I could, and I really think it was that everyone has a breaking point. Everyone has a point where I've given all I've got. I haven't got any more. I just can't do it. And he'd hit his. It's a sad story. But I think that is the truth.
I want to remind everybody that we're talking to naval historian Craig Symonds, and he is the author of the book Operation Neptune, about the naval phase of the D-Day landings, and that we've been talking about Exercise Tiger, which is a specific rehearsal and part of Operation Neptune, although I would love to, if it's not too early to do it, to broaden that out a little bit and ask a couple of other questions. And Craig, one of Chris's all-time personal heroes after Yoda in Star Wars is Freddie Morgan, General Freddie Morgan, who becomes a Cossack. He does not become a Russian cavalry officer, but he becomes the chief of staff of the Supreme Allied Commander. He's the chief of staff to someone who doesn't exist yet in 1943, and he's going to be planning the D-Day landings.
Right.
And one of the things that you wrote in your book, which I just sort of thought was amazing, is he gets this assignment, and he literally does not know if he should take it seriously.
Right. That's
that
true.
is fairly bizarre. Can you explain that to us?
Well, I can, or I can try to anyway. Frederick Morgan, like you, I think Frederick Morgan is an underappreciated participant in all of this. He's the guy, after all, that picks Normandy as the target beaches. I mean, it's because of him. But the orders that he got are in three parts. And the first part is that he's going to try to confuse the Germans as to what's going on. And in order to confuse the Germans, he's going to sponsor false radio emissions, pretending that there's a fourth British army at Edinburgh that's targeted to invade Norway. later on as part of Operation Fortitude. There's going to be a mythical Sixth Army near London that's going to be invade the Pas de Calais. So all of this misinformation campaign is going on. And that's part of his portfolio. He's going to be in charge of some of that. And then in addition to that, he's supposed to plan for a contingency invasion. Now, early on when the British and the Americans were talking about not only should we go into occupied France, but particularly when should we go into occupied France, the pull and the tug is that the Americans want to go right now. We want to go tomorrow morning, immediately. The British say, well, now let's wait. Don't you realize what's happening here? I mean, over there on the Eastern Front, communists are killing Nazis and Nazis are killing communists. Why should we be
Let it ride.
ready to stop that? So, we can take our time with this thing. So this pulling and tugging is going back and forth. But one aspect of that argument is an operation that the Americans come up with called Sledgehammer, which is horribly misnamed. Because the whole idea of it is, what are we going to do if, one, the Germans suddenly collapse? If the people turn on Hitler, the government falls, and there's just a complete breakdown, we got to be ready to go in and pounce. Or, alternatively, if the Russians get so desperate that they're about to collapse, or if the Russians, in fact, capture Berlin and start heading toward the Channel, we got to have something on the shelf to get in a hurry if we need to, and that's going to be Sledgehammer. Well, Sledgehammer was supposed to take place in 1943, obviously does not, but it's a plan on the shelf, so have that plan ready, Freddie Morgan. Get ready with that, too. And then, third, by the way, the third thing in your portfolio is plan an actual invasion of German-occupied France for 1944. Well, you can see Morgan getting these three saying, well, no, wait, this first one's a fake, the second one's conditional, and the third one is
fantastic.
Maybe. I don't really know, but he's a professional. He's got to take this all seriously. So he does contribute to the misinformation campaign, about which we can talk more later. He also puts this plan, he and his team, not he alone. I mean, he has a whole team, a score to 60, depending on when it is, working on all this stuff, getting out the maps and figuring out the landing zones and the tides and all of the details that go into making such a plan. So he's got that. And then this third one. And so he's the guy who writes up the original plan, Overlord. It's going to be modified, but he's the original author of this thing, and almost nobody knows that.
Chris does.
I do.
Yes, I know.
People all the time.
And I think our audience does, because Chris has told them.
Craig, what are the questions that we've talked about briefly? We've gotten a question from Lynn about that I wanted to ask you. I get all the time. We had, by this point in the war, we had made a few wet foot landings in the Pacific. And was there anybody in the Pacific that kind of came to Europe and said, hey guys, we know a little bit about getting our feet wet? And if nobody did do that, why wasn't there that?
Okay. That's a good question, but it's actually the other way around. Okay. Ramsey, maybe to get Kirk out of his way, because he didn't like Kirk, but sends Kirk after the landings in Salerno in the Mediterranean, south of Naples. After that, Kirk is sent to Chester Nimitz's command in Pearl Harbor. And his job is to go out there and brief Nimitz's staff. He actually lives in Nimitz's house for a week, goes to all the morning staff meetings, briefs all the command team in preparation for the landings in the Pacific, and they share information there back and forth. So there is some sharing. There is not, however, much sharing of operators in the Pacific going to Europe. It's the other way around. As I mentioned, Kirk, there's also Richard Connolly, what they call close-in Connolly, who attacked at Salerno. He's in charge of the gunfire support group for the landing on Kwajalein Atoll and later on Saipan. So there are people who have amphibious experience in the Mediterranean who go out to the Pacific and participate in that. That said, these are very different problems. Mm-hmm. And let me show, it's self-evident why. If you're going to attack an island, let's say Tarawa, you cut that island off you bomb it from the air, you surround it with gunfire support ships, and you pound the crap out of it. But you can do that for 3 days, 5 days, 20 days, 30 days. You can do that as long as you want, because you know what? No reinforcements are coming to the defenders of that island because it's an island. If you do the same thing to the coast of Normandy, if you pound the heck out of the land behind Omaha Beach for 26 days in a row, the Germans are going to figure that out. Aha! Omaha Beach, we know now what they're going to do. So the fact that you're on the edge of a continent in Europe rather than an island that cannot be supported or reinforced makes the operations significantly different. So
that's a good answer.
I'm going to come back to a question that we got about Exercise Tiger. We could definitely go to the 2-hour version of the show this week, but don't worry, we will not. But Frank Cook asks this, and I noted this as well. There's a lot of discrepancies about the number of people who died at Operation Tiger, and is that a result of secrecy, or is it a result of different ways of counting, or do you have any idea what's going on there?
The answer to the first two questions is yes. The answer to the last question is no. I really don't. I mean, I encountered this too, of course. You go to the monument and you look at the numbers on it, and it supposedly includes everybody who was killed that day, everybody who died subsequently, anybody who had a heart attack after they heard about it. I'm not really sure. It seems to be a somewhat inflated number, the 739 figure. The 639, the Navy report, that's initial mortal casualties of the event. And it's probably somewhere in between, which is what Stephen says, and he's probably pretty close. I hate to argue. It's never like arguing with Stephen. He's pretty good.
So,
go ahead, Chris.
So, Craig, one of the things that kind of bigger picture again, we know, thanks to books like from Joe Balkowski and all these other people, what every single company in the U.S. Army did on the morning of June 6th and where the 29th is going and the 1st is going. Could you talk a little bit about what some of the Navy personnel are doing, not just on the ships, but what sorts of roles are they involved in? Because obviously massively involved on that morning, and we don't know enough about them.
Yeah. Well, they're busy. The experience of those who actually had to go ashore, not only that morning, but in the 14 days that followed. We think of D-Day as an invasion that took place early on June the 6th, but of course it takes place all day on the 6th and the 7th and the 8th and the 9th and the 10th. Stuff's coming ashore all the time. If you don't sustain and expand that foothold, it's going to be pushed into the sea. So it's intense. But the Navy's job is to support and sustain all of that. And it means they're busy all the time. Let me use the LST as an example. One of the reasons why they are so crucial to make this happen is not just that they can deposit large amounts of cargo and supplies and wheeled vehicles right onto the beach, as well as manpower, but also because they can then retract from that. They actually have a stern anchor that they drop offshore, and then they winch themselves, they close the doors, winch themselves back out off the beach, turn around, go back to England, get another load, come back, land again. Some of these LSTs made 50 round trips, 100 channel crossings or more in the ensuing month. So if you calculate, and I actually did this, and I don't have the numbers to my finger, but I'm going to use roundabout numbers. The speed of an LST, about 10 knots, the distance they had to travel to Portsmouth, the unloading and unloading time at each end, those ships are either loading or unloading or underway 24 hours a day for a month. So you think about what that's like for the crew. I mean, they're exhausted. Nobody's taking a shower or playing cards. I mean, this is everybody's on, all hands on deck, quite literally, all the time. And it's chaotic because it's not like you get into the porch and say, well, here's the cargo that we've had designated for you. What do you got? How can I get it? How fast can I get it on board? It has to be combat loaded. It has to be backed in. What do you need? You need blood plasma or you need ammunition. And so all of that has to take place. So it's a frenetic, chaotic, nearly constant shuttle service back and forth between Plymouth and Portsmouth and the landing beaches.
Well, and as long as we're doing a shout out, there's also, and you really talk about this in your book, when the crisis moment occurs kind of in the morning of June 6th. And it is the Navy, and it is specifically, it's not the big battleships that are there, the Texas and the Arkansas, that come to the rescue. It's the destroyers. It's the Tin Can Navy that really comes to the rescue of the troops on the beach.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I mentioned earlier when I was comparing the Pacific with Europe, that an extended bombardment, an extended attack by big gun ships on a specific point that lasts more than a couple of days, it gives away the ball game. So the bombardment was abbreviated. It was relatively short. They started firing at 5 o'clock in the morning. The troops were supposed to hit the beach at 6:30. That doesn't give you a big window for doing a lot of damage. But the airplanes too came in and bombed like crazy. But there's a heavy overcast, the remnants of that storm that so worried Eisenhower when he had to make the decision to go. That overcast is still there, so the visibility is very bad. So in order not to hit the landing craft heading for the beach, most of the planes went too far inland and cratered up the countryside without doing a lot of damage to the German fortifications. So when the men actually get ashore, they find that a lot of those German pillboxes and machine guns are still in position, and the artillery, not just the 88s, but all sorts of pre-sighted artillery, some of which is still there, is covering that beach. And they are pinned down. Omaha, most famously. Omaha is where they really have trouble getting off the beach. They get to the high tide line where there's this little kind of mound of shingle they can kind of hide behind, and they really just can't get any further unless they want to commit suicide. And what salvages the situation is this group of about 9 destroyers, a couple of British, but most Americans, Desron 29, I think it is, or 27, Captain Sanders. They come in and they get these orders. You know, their job was to screen the fleet from outside. They're supposed to be watching for submarines and E-boats, but now no, get in there, get on those guys. And in they come. Now, one of the things you have to know about Omaha Beach, and really all of the Normandy invasion beaches, is the extraordinarily gradual fall of the beach line. It's only 1 foot down for 50 feet horizontally. So it's very gradual, which is why there's such high tides. The high tide or the low tide exposes, almost a mile more of beach than the high tide does. Well, that extends out into the water. So how close can the destroyers get? They draw 13 feet of water. If they get too close, they'll go aground, and then it's curtains, because an immobile ship is just a sitting duck. So, but they come charging in, and they get so close. Captain Sanford later said, I think at one point we had less than an inch of water under the keel. They got so close, they were being hit by rifle bullets from the ground behind the beach. And from there, they open up with these 5-inch guns. Now, 5-inch guns, 5 inches sounds pretty big. That's a big shell. But compared to the big 14-inch guns that hit them in the morning, they're relatively small, but they were accurate. And one of the ways, I think one of the really illuminating ways that shows how the Army and the Navy could cooperate on the fly was that the few tanks that got ashore would fire into a specific point on the cliff. The destroyer skippers offshore would see that, notice it, and say, that's where the German guns are, because you can't see them from the sea, utterly camouflaged, buried in the cliff face. So they would open on that position, and then when the tanks started shooting someplace else, the destroyers changed the targeting and hit that spot. And then later on, after the troops were able to move inland, they actually got call fire from the men, on the coordinates, so they could call in fire. But I do think you're right. I think that was a critical moment. Omaha Beach could have been a disaster. It was disastrous enough for those who fell there, but it could have been strategically disastrous. And one of the things that made sure it was not was the role played by those 9 tin cans.
Well, and Craig, had there been any kind of rehearsal or coordination between those tin can sailors and the landing crew? So this is all, they're intuiting this at the moment as everything
is on the fly. And I think it's a testimony to, you can make all the plans you want, but the old the old joke. You mentioned one earlier that amateurs talk strategy and professionals talk logistics. Well, here's another one that professionals say: no plan survives first contact with the enemy.
Right.
And that was true here. You have to be prepared to figure it out on the fly, and that's what happened at Omaha Beach.
Craig,
Wow. Go ahead, Chris.
Oh, just real quick, because again, this is something that's come up. Could you talk just really briefly about maybe the Coast Guard? I understand was there at Normandy.
Yeah,
and
a lot of Coast Guard ships were there, and they don't get credit for that either. I don't have the numbers to hand, but there were whole flotillas of Coast Guard cutters that participated, not in the particular events on the morning of those 9 destroyers. Those were all USN or RN ships, but in escorting the landing ships across the channel and in preliminary gunfire support, the Coast Guard cutters played. Roosevelt nationalized, militarized, if you would, took them away from the transportation service and gave them to the Navy. But they were still Coast Guard. They wore Coast Guard uniforms, had Coast Guard officers, Coast Guard personnel. But he had nationalized them in 1942. So by 1944, they were used to playing that role. And Coast Guard cutters played, they escorted convoys across the North Atlantic. They attacked submarines off the Cape Hatteras. I mean, Coast Guard cutters served in the war as full-scale military vehicles. And people should remember that.
So, Chris would be really disappointed if I didn't try in
All right.
closing minutes to work in the Ghost Army, and I think our audience would be disappointed.
Okay.
But I'm actually going to go obliquely at this. There is, as you mentioned, a deception operation, Operation Fortitude,
right,
different from the Ghost Army, which is to fool the Germans where the landings will take place. And part of that is that there are some inflatable LSTs, I know, that are moored in England, hopefully to fool the German air reconnaissance, which was largely, I think, non-existent. But I have a really interesting photograph that comes not from England, but comes from Fort Belvoir in probably December 1943, where they're testing out a configuration here, which is this is an inflatable LCT, landing craft tank, with inflatable vehicles in it. And so I find it a remarkable photo. I don't think this was ever used in combat, but I wanted to kind of get your response and reaction to it, or to any part of that as you
Yeah. Well, I had never seen that before. You sent it to me this morning. So I studied that, looked at it. I have not been able to find any that it was operationally deployed in any way. We have all seen the films because they're so much fun to watch, of the fake tanks and the fake trucks, inflatables, fake camps, and all this business. There's a famous piece of footage where it shows an inflatable tank, and then a soldier comes over and picks it up and flips it over with his bare hands. And I think the appeal of these things is it allows us to think, those stupid Germans, boy, did we fool them. It's almost like British schoolboys stealing the mascot of the other team. We're gonna put one over on you, you Doomkopf. I don't know that it had a whole lot of impact on German planning. I think Hitler personally was convinced by the British Fourth Army that wasn't really in Edinburgh and didn't exist, by the Sixth Army down in East Anglia and around London that was supposedly headed for the Pas de Calais. The Americans contributed by sending Patton over there, and the Germans all thought, oh, well, wherever Patton goes, that's where the threat is, and so on. So I do think it kept them in a position where they really weren't sure. But I think it falls into a broader group of wanting to be really clever. And one example of this is what are called Hobart's Funnies. This guy, Percy Hobart, who was actually Montgomery's brother-in-law, came up with all these little Rube Goldberg little inventions, that we're gonna, we'll show those Germans by these clever things. You talked about the DD tank when we were chatting earlier. Here's a duplex drive tank designed to be launched 3 miles offshore. And as you see in the photo on the right, it would be virtually submerged, but for about a 9-inch freeboard, and go all the way in, and then they'd drop the shroud, as you see on the left, and it would be operated as a tank. Well, half of these go straight to the bottom. So, and it's probably the most successful of all of these gimmick weapons that came up. So I just don't know how much this had to do with the final outcome of D-Day. But I will generalize by saying that I think the British in general, and Churchill in particular, were more enamored of these things than the Americans. The American attitude, as Russ Weigley said in his wonderful book, The American Way of War, our idea is accumulate mass resources, blow the crap out of them, and then overwhelm them with firepower and numbers. And the British said, oh no, we can be clever.
Yes. Well, there are a lot more.
You're happy with that answer, Chris?
Yes. Well, Craig, I guess unfortunately we're coming to the end of the hour, so I have to ask one of these, the big wrap-up questions that stirs the blood. How did Admiral King kind of view the Navy's participation in D-Day? Because he was so focused on the Pacific, and I guess kind of as an extension of that, why do you think that we don't know more about the Navy on D-Day?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the one thing people tend to say as well, that it's the biggest fleet ever assembled, is 6,900 and some odd vessels. But of course, that means you're counting all of those landing craft, which are pretty small. But even if you exclude all of those, we're probably talking 4,000 ships. So it's the biggest armada ever assembled. But it's mostly transport, cargo ships, amphibious ships, some old, almost out of date battleships firing 14-inch shells. The Arkansas and the Texas that shelled Utah and Omaha Beach were built in 1912. So it's not an awesome collection of firepower so much as it is the logistical ability to sustain an amphibious landing. And you mentioned King's preference for the Atlantic. I think that's been a bit overblown. He did often squawk at the combined chiefs of staff meetings that the Pacific wasn't getting its fair share. And partly that's because the original distribution of assets was 85% Europe, 15% Pacific. And he did not think that was enough to keep the Japanese back on their heels. So he finally got that changed to 65-35. But he never really gave up on the idea of Europe first. That was the official strategy. He bought it. He believed it. He lived up to it. And that meant not only the invasion across the Channel, it meant getting across the North Atlantic in the first place. That North Atlantic supply chain from Canada and the United States to the British Isles, the Battle of Britain, was a huge undertaking that involved thousands of ships and lasted for years. And that was a major Allied undertaking, and King backed it.
Well, listen, Craig Symonds, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a fabulous hour. We're getting many positive comments, and we really appreciate your taking an hour to talk to us about the underappreciated role of several navies in the D-Day landings. And a reminder that your book, which is an excellent book, is Operation Neptune. It's one of 12 or 300 that you've written. I'm not sure how many, but it is, if not the most recent, one of the most recent, and a terrific book. And you've been a terrific guest. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rick. I appreciate it. Thank you, Chris.
Really appreciate it.
All right.
Great.
All right.
Thanks so much,
Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. That was awesome.
That was great.
That was awesome. I didn't get, a chance to show my favorite picture
but you did anyway, didn't you?
Chris Anderson there making that no-go weather decision at Suffolk House, and then
he's saying fish and chips,
and then the whole staff then poses for a picture in front of the map room. So we have that all. Great show today, if I may say, or great guest today. I don't really want to compliment
couldn't agree
us.
more.
I want to compliment the guest. And we have a very interesting show next week as well. The book is The SS Officer's Armchair, Uncovering the Hidden Life of a Nazi. And it's a really fascinating story. And it kind of continues our World War II theme that we've been spending a little bit of time on. And I'm really looking forward to that one as well.
It should be great. It should be great.
All right.
And hopefully we can convince Craig to come back and maybe talk about.
Well, hopefully we can. And
Something
I
else.
know he's still listening to us. So, Craig, hang on there. We'll chat with you when the show is over. And to everybody else, we'll say, guys, thank you so much for joining us again.
Be safe, everybody.